We've all had awkward moments when we were way out of our comfort zone. They are unsettling moments, sometimes embarrassing moments. We try to avoid them, but some are thrust upon us and we can't do anything about it. Here are a few examples of awkward moments some had to suffer. Maybe you can identify. It's awkward when you are a girl and your dad picks out your clothing. It's awkward when you are a boy and your dad picks out your clothing and he was raised in the 80s. It's awkward when your mom makes your clothing and you feel obligated to wear it. It's awkward when you go for that spike look in your 7th grade pictures and you blow it. It's awkward when you were still trying for that same look for your senior pictures and you still blow it. It's awkward when you are the one giving birth, but your husband is the one who needs medical attention. It's awkward when you have to sit in the Ohio State student section and you're from Michigan. There are definitely comfort zone violations in these pictures. The concept of comfort zone is one that's familiar with us. It's been defined as an invisible barrier which makes us feel safe and secure. Safe and secure. That sounds nice, doesn't it? But a comfort zone can be a trap. It can be a rut that we are stuck in because it is familiar and easy and sheltering, and we just gravitate toward that. It can become a real dead-end refuge that we retreat to, keeping us from venturing out to try something new or something more creative or something better. And so it can keep us stuck where we are when we really need to move on to greater heights. It can be something that keeps us from growing or becoming more productive and then experiencing greater blessings in our life. The series of sermons that we started last week is entitled Faith or Fear. And we're talking about how fear diminishes faith or faith overcomes our fear. Today we're going to look at the idea of finding the courage to step beyond our comfort zone, to step out in faith. We will look at the life of a man who felt very secure and safe in his comfort zone, but God had greater plans for him. And so God had to pry him out of his comfort zone, overcoming his fears in order to help him step up and step out in faith. That man's name was Gideon. He was born about 1,250 years before the time of Christ. His nation of Israel was under constant attack and harassment by an enemy army known as the Midianites. Let's read the beginning of Gideon's story as it's recorded in Judges chapter 6, verses 2 through 6. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. And God answered those prayers. He answered those prayers by sending a leader, an unpromising leader. God sent an unpromising leader in order to demonstrate his power through the life of an unlikely hero. And so in a similar way, God calls us. We may feel like we too are unlikely heroes. God will call us often out of our comfort zone to serve him in greater ways than we could ever imagine. In order to do that, God must see us as we can be. He did Gideon. Let's look at the call he extended to Gideon to lead his people in verses 11 and 12 of Judges chapter 6. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the yoke in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." God knows us by our potential. Did you notice what the angel called Gideon? Mighty warrior. Really? Was he? We see him hiding in a winepress, threshing wheat. How mighty was he? A winepress in those days was often dug down through the soil into the bedrock of limestone, where it was carved out in the limestone. And so it actually was in a pit. Often an enclosure was built around it so that it was completely hidden from sight on the inside. That's where Gideon was threshing wheat. Wheat was never threshed like that. Wheat was always threshed out in the open sky so the wind could blow the chaff away. But here was Gideon in this enclosed winepress, this small space, confined there with all the dust and the chaff floating around in the air, coughing and wheezing because he was afraid of the enemy. A mighty warrior? Not on the outside. But God saw who Gideon would become once he stepped out of his comfort zone. What knew you? What better version of yourself? One that is more capable, more accomplished, more successful, is hidden behind your fears, waiting to be released. God knows we are capable of much more than we think we are. He sees our hidden strengths, as he did with Gideon. Let's move on in the story to verse 14 in Judges chapter 6. The Lord said to him, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hands. Am I not sending you?" Go in the strength you have, he said. What strength did Gideon demonstrate? What strength did he have who was hiding from his enemy? Was it really enough? Gideon wanted to know that too. And so he responded in protest to God's call, as we read in verse 15. "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. I'm the least qualified for this, God. I'm the least capable. How could it be that I would save Israel? You've got the wrong person." Gideon wasn't being humble. He was being fearful. He failed to hear God's rhetorical question in the commission God spoke to him, as we saw in verse 14, when he asked, "Am I not sending you?" Gideon wanted to know if he was enough. God assured him that he was enough because God himself would go with Gideon. He confirmed that in verse 16 when God said, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." You see, with God, our strength, our ability is always enough. So do not fear stepping out of your comfort zone. God is your comfort, and he will always be with you. He will work through you. If God calls you to some service or some task, don't question your ability. He would not call you if he knew you were unable. But with God, you are able. We sometimes, however, get in the way of God's plans for our lives. Our fears or our love for our comfort zone inhibits us and prohibits God from working through us. Our comfort zone looks too inviting. Safe and secure is much easier than taking a risk. Have you ever chosen the safe option and stayed in your comfort zone instead of venturing out? Let's call that the Gideon syndrome. It's an expression of fear. Maybe the fear of failure, or the fear of rejection, or the fear of uneasiness. The Gideon syndrome says, I know God is bigger than this, and I know that all things are possible to those who believe, and I know He is a God of miracles, but I am not a person of great ability. But this is way out of my wheelhouse. But I'm the last person who should be considered for this. And we stay in our comfort zone and we take the safe option, the easy option, because it's much more comfortable and our comfort is more important to us than God's plan for our lives. Where is our faith if we resort to that position? It seems that the Gideon syndrome plagues people whose faith is in themselves, not in God. They see what they cannot do and give up or refuse to try. And there is never a thought as to what God can do. They don't give Him the chance. Maybe you won't attempt something that could be greatly beneficial because it's uncomfortable. Stop living by faith in yourself and live by faith in God. Maybe you feel inadequate compared to others. Stop living by faith in yourself and live by faith in God. Maybe you ignore God's call on your life because you feel you aren't ready, or you aren't worthy, or you aren't qualified. Stop. Stop living by faith in yourself and live by faith in God. Fortunately, Gideon had just enough faith to rise above himself and trust God and follow Him. And that's all the faith that it took to bring salvation for the entire nation of Israel. We often must battle our fears in order to follow God's plans for our lives. Gideon's fears kept emerging and re-emerging. He put God through a series of tests. He asked God for 3 signs. I want to encourage you. We're not going to be able to read all of the story in Judges chapter 6 and 7, but go home today and read those chapters for yourself. It'll give a fuller understanding of what was going on here and what was in Gideon's heart and how God had to work in him to make him ready. But Gideon asked God for 3 signs. The first sign he asked for was, God, if you're going to show me that you are really in this, and if you're going to expect me to really follow you, then I want you to do this. I'm going to slaughter an animal for sacrifice and lay it on the altar, but I'm not going to light the fire. You send fire down from heaven and consume that sacrifice. And if you do that, I'll know that it's your power that's calling me, and I will follow you anywhere. And so he prepared the animal, laid it on the altar, and he waited, and he didn't have to wait but just several seconds, and fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice. And Gideon said, okay, I am in. And he was, for a short time, until the time came for him to actually step out and lead the small army of Israel against the mighty forces of Midian. And then he faltered again, and he said, God, I need another sign. I just have to be sure. And so, God, here's what I want to do. I want to lay out this wool fleece on the ground tonight before I go to sleep. And during the night, I want you to send the dew of heaven down and just saturate that fleece. But make sure that the ground all around it is dry. And then I'll know that this is you that's calling me, and your power is at work here. And so he laid the fleece out, and he went to sleep, and he woke up the next morning, and the fleece was just saturated, but the ground all around it was dry. And Gideon thought, well, maybe this can be explained by a natural phenomenon. Maybe the wool fleece acted like a sponge, and it just soaked up all the dew of the ground around it, and that's what happened here. So, God, I'm going to ask you for a third sign. And here's what I want you to do. This time I'm going to lay out the fleece, and I want you to send the dew of heaven and soak the ground all around the fleece, but keep the fleece dry. And so he did. He laid the fleece out. He went to sleep. He woke up the next morning, and God answered that prayer. The fleece was dry, but the ground all around it was saturated. And finally, Gideon believed God. Here's what I want you to see through that process. God was patient with Gideon as he struggled with his fears. The fears that you have when God calls you to step out of your comfort zone and follow him, whatever that might be, those fears are natural. God will be patient with you as you work through them. God will help you as you struggle with your fears. So don't be afraid to ask God for help with your fears. I never wanted to become a preacher. When I was a young teenager, our church minister began encouraging me to go into the preaching ministry, as did a few of the elders of our church and my parents and a couple of friends as well. It seemed that everyone wanted me to go into this profession except for me. I was frightened by the prospect of preaching to a crowd of people. In fact, I dropped out of speech class my junior year for that very reason. I just could not do it. I knew my deficiencies. I knew I wasn't qualified for public speaking, nor was I qualified for leading a church or for counseling and helping people deal with their problems. And I didn't want to do evangelism. I didn't want to talk to people about following Christ if they weren't already doing that and try to convince them to do so. I didn't want to be in that kind of a situation. That was a difficult thing for me. I also didn't want to conduct funerals. I didn't want to go to hospitals and visit sick people. I didn't want to go to nursing homes and visit with those who were dying. All of those things were way out of my comfort zone. So I resisted. But through a series of events in my late teen years, I knew God was calling me into this kind of ministry. He heavily convicted me. And I hesitantly followed. And do you know what all those fears from my inadequacies have done for me through the years? They have driven me to my knees constantly, seeking God's help. I pray weekly for the inspiration and the leading and the anointing of the Holy Spirit on my life, because I know I cannot do this alone. And those fears, they've also driven me to my desk and to my library and to the scriptures to prepare for sermons and lessons and leadership training and counseling sessions. I had been in this profession for 49 years, and I still would never step into the pulpit or into a classroom without ample preparation. I know I need God and the tools that He has provided me for this role. And do you know what I've found through the years consistently? God has continued to provide all I have needed to succeed. That's what He did for Gideon. And that's what He will do for you. So don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone and achieve for His kingdom. He will lead you. He will bless your efforts. He will provide what you need. There was a lengthy turning point in my faith journey. It began when I was 19 years old in April of 1974. That was when a minister of a church in Reynoldsburg, Ohio, approached me and asked me to be their first youth minister. Those were the days before youth ministry was a thing. I wasn't even sure what a youth minister really did. He was asking me to teach his teenagers, and I had not even taught anybody at that point. He was also asking me to help them develop a youth program for their church. I didn't even know what that looked like. But he asked. And without hesitating, I heard myself say yes. Because I had this passing inspiration that if God is leading this, He will provide what is needed. And He did. That youth ministry was greatly successful, and that experience helped prepare me for the ministry that I would commit my life to for the next 47 years afterwards. I have learned to ignore my comfort zone and to respond to God's call no matter what it is. I have had to step up and attempt many things I was uncomfortable doing because it needed to be done. I have had to take the lead when I wasn't sure what the destination was because I knew it was for the good of the church. I have had to take on unfamiliar roles and stressful responsibilities because somebody needed to. And God was always there. And continuously, the question He asked Gideon rings in my ears. Have I not sent you? Have I not sent you? And God is sending you. He's sending you into a classroom to instill faith in a child's life. He's sending you into the nursing home to provide comfort for the lonely. He is sending you into a friend's house to guide that person to Christ. He's sending you into some kind of ministry to provide the needed help. He is sending you to visit someone to bring that person back to God and His church. It is uncomfortable stuff, I understand. But do not be afraid. Step out of your comfort zone. Step up in faith, and God will go with you. He will help you conquer your fears and achieve. As a result of stepping out of his comfort zone, Gideon experienced great blessings. Israel was delivered. Let's look at the end of Gideon's story in Judges 8:28. And Midian was subdued before Israel and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land enjoyed peace 40 years. Gideon was able to live to a ripe old age in peace. He had many sons and daughters. He who had been the least likely hero is a man whose story is still told and whose name is still spoken over 3,000 years later. If there is one moral to the story of Gideon's life, it is this: don't be afraid to go out on a limb for God. That's where the fruit is. Step out of your comfort zone and follow God, and He will lead you the right way. Let's stand as we sing our closing song.